I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. When someone has a public profile or public content, we really are only looking at the things that they are doing. We don't always get a lot of feedback about the things they're not doing and who they're not talking to, who they're not hosting on their podcast. Today's episode is about biohacking, and as I got thinking about how I wanted to approach this topic, it made me pause and reflect on how difficult it is to see all of the decisions that go into making a podcast even, or showing up online in a particular way. And interestingly, we've maybe had the opportunity to do this topic 1,000 times since we started the podcast, because we get asked, I don't know, it's maybe like 5 or 6 times per week to host people on the podcast, which I take as a big compliment. We're a larger Canadian medical podcast, and so I think that's great that people want to reach our audience. But we're declining maybe 4 or 5 people per week who want to talk about things that are in this sort of scope of biohacking. And even some of the most famous health influencer people on the planet right now who are real advocates of biohacking and maybe even consider themselves to be the inventors of biohacking, we've declined having them on the podcast. One of them we said we would have, as long as they were willing to have an open conversation about how little research there is on biohacking, and then they declined. So it's as good as us declining. But you don't get to see that. You only see the topics we did pick. You only see the guests we do support. You don't always get to see the things that we don't choose. And so I think by having this conversation, my goals of having this conversation is kind of twofold. One is I think it's an important discussion to have right now because there's so much going on around this concept of biohacking, but it also helps you see, under the covers as far as how we make decisions about the kind of information that we do bring you, which I think is incredibly important. So the term biohacking, and I actually looked up a couple of references because I wanted to make sure the term that I was using was actually the term that is out there. And so we're going to use a little bit of a broader definition of biohacking because my personal definition is a little broader than the ones I found online. But it's this idea of trying to hack your own biology, either by using technology or by using cutting edge ideas associated with biology to have the greatest health possible. And those formal definitions sounded way better than what I just said. But it's the idea of trying to collect your own user data essentially, and then modify your health or add things to your life or behave in a certain way based on that feedback. Let's say a wearable, right? Based on that feedback, you're going to do things to try and have the most sort of ultimate health experience possible. So it's this bridge or this connection between technology, innovation, and personal health pursuit. And in general, biohacking is on so cutting edge that we have almost no research for a lot of it. And that in and even of itself is part of the culture of biohacking. It's like, this is so innovative that only the cool kids are doing it. Um, and that's really what it's about. Some references talk about it with respect to, they call it like citizen science, which I think is actually kind of an interesting term, where we've given the public access to particular science metrics. Sometimes it's lab tests you can do at home, like poop tests or spit tests or hair tests or genetic tests. Sometimes it's data collection, right? Like for your own body, like tracking your temperature, tracking your glucose, tracking like those pieces, right? So they call it like citizen science, which again, I think is kind of a neat term. But, right, there's my big but. It's assuming, right, like if we love biohacking and if you love biohacking, it's assuming that all of that citizen science or getting access to all of that information is helpful. And I'm going to walk us through some things to think about today with respect to biohacking that may make you second guess whether or not this is the right kind of approach for you with your health, and have you think a little bit more critically when you do come across some of these pieces. And even I'll say, like as a practitioner, I work with people who are generally pretty frustrated with their health and frustrated with the medical system. So when you see like glitz and glamour associated with diagnostic tests or at-home resources or new wearable technology that's at the forefront of cutting-edge science, and like the people you work with are frustrated, it's easy to see why we would maybe put those two things together, right? Like we've got frustrated patients over here and we have some cool, like publicly accessible sciencey stuff over here. Maybe we can marry those two and everybody is happy. Um, but interestingly, like the people who are the most happy about biohacking are the people who sell biohacking shit, right? Like the things that track all these things and like these point of sale lab tests that you can buy on the internet, they're the people that are winning in the biohacking race. And so I would really like you to have a pretty critical eye about this as you move forward. So when I talk about biohacking, I'm generally talking about doing anything that might be taking supplements, that might be exercising in a certain way, that's trying to manipulate your body's biology based on, the most innovative and cutting edge research ideas that are out there, even if they are not quite proven yet. So that's how I would throw supplements in there. Although I would say that the definition online, if you actually just Google it and look up some scientific papers on biohacking, they generally are talking about things like wearables and where technology is meeting this sort of citizen science. But when I talk about it, often when people wear the wearable and learn the thing, they do a supplement on the end of that to try and fix whatever they think is wrong with them. So I'm looping the supplements in there because I think it's an important part of the conversation. So I guess the first question I would ask you about biohacking and whether or not this is something that you want to consider is whether or not we would be okay with this kind of approach in conventional medicine. And I will play this kind of devil's advocate game often with clinicians, where clinicians in the wellness space will get mad if Pfizer sponsors a cruise for medical doctors to go like learn about stuff. I mean, we'd probably even get mad if Pfizer gave a doctor a pen, right? We would say, don't you dare write with that pen, you're biased. And yet, in the health and wellness space, the vast majority of continuing education, et cetera, is all funded by supplement companies or lab companies. My personal company is the exception to that, the Confident Clinician, where we have zero industry funding. But the vast majority of continuing education for integrative medicine is funded by industry. And we would actually get very mad if all of the conventional doctors' training was run by drug companies, and yet we do the very same thing. So I often play this devil's advocate where I'm like, if the shoe was on the other foot, is that the saying? If the shoe was on the other foot, like how would we feel about it? So if a doctor came out to you and you're in the waiting room or you're in your appointment and they said, we have this brand new cutting edge drug that has barely been tested in anyone, and you are going to be one of the first ones to figure out if it works. I want you to take it. There's no research studies on it, but this famous guy takes it. He actually runs whole retreats about why you should take this drug, and I'm going to get you to take it. And it's going to be really hard for us to tell if it works, but take it and you will be cool and hopefully you feel better. And I know I'm being kind of an asshole, but like, think for a second about any kind of biohacking that you've seen online. And generally, that's kind of what we're asking you to do. We're saying, this is so new. This is so innovative. This is so special. Nobody does it. We have no research on it. Nobody knows about it. And people lap it up. But I'm like, dude, if that was a drug, even drugs that we've studied on millions of people, we're skeptical about. So why is it suddenly okay for something to be all right with zero research on it? Like when do we draw that line in the sand and we say, oh, if it's natural, it's totally fine that we have no research on it? Or, oh, if this celebrity's doing it, then it's totally fine we have no research on it. Whereas if it's a medication, like we want billions of people to be researched before we even willing to like consider it. So if we put the shoe on the other foot, again, I'm not totally sure I'm using that cliche properly. I think we would have a problem with the same rationale that we use for biohacking in conventional care. Even if we talked technology, right? And we said, we're going to implant this particular device in your body and track your every move. And we're not totally sure if that data is validated or actually helps us make any decisions, but we're going to track it anyways. And at the end of it, we're going to give you a drug. You'd be like, no, thank you. Meanwhile, we're willing to run like a genetic test and change our diet, or we're willing to run some kind of poop test and then take a bunch of probiotics and supplements about it. Like it's really the same, right? If we thought about it in the same frame, it would be like the same. So if you're uncomfortable with innovation in conventional medicine, if you would never be the first person to sign up to take a drug in a clinical trial because you'd like want to see if it worked first, then biohacking is not really for you, because that's kind of what we're doing over here. If you wouldn't be willing to track, what we didn't understand data-wise, in the conventional sense, then maybe that biohacking is not for you, right? Because we're tracking data that hasn't been that well validated, meaning like if you're going to wear a continuous glucose monitor, and we've talked about this before on the podcast, first of all, they're not reliable from one monitor to the next, and we're not even really clear if giving you that information helps you. And so if you're not comfortable being that innovative on the conventional side, you really have to ask yourself why you're willing to be so innovative over on the health and wellness side. Okay, so that's like a negative with biohacking. But let's talk about maybe a positive, okay? Something to consider with this is whether or not you feel better by being on a plan, or you feel better just by doing things. There's lots of benefit to feeling connected to yourself, to a plan, to a goal, right? Like I think your goal of health is probably admirable, right? Like your goal is awesome and we would like you to hit it. I'm not sure that I want to be super judgy on the way that you hit it, right? If you hit it. I don't know if we care what kind of path you take as long as you hit your goal. So if your goal is to have better energy and wearing an Aura ring helps you go to bed earlier and be more mindful during the day, maybe the Aura ring's not particular, like maybe it's not validated. And actually, they have decent research on the Aura ring. I wear one. I'm just using that as an example. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that maybe the research on it wasn't that hot, and yet doing the thing gave you the outcome that we were looking for. I don't know if we're mad about that, right? If if using an app to track parts of your cycle, or if running a test that maybe you didn't need, but the test got you connected to your nutrition in a way that you've never been connected before and you ate so much healthier afterwards. Am I mad about that? Like, I guess not. I'd probably rather you not spend the money on a silly genetic nutrition lab test. But if it helped you get connected to the same behaviors that I would have had you do anyways, then I think I'm happy. The problem is that I don't want your biohacking to get you connected to behaviors that I don't care if you're doing, right? Like, it has to get you close to the same protocol I would have given you even without the biohacking. And now, of course, you have to ask the question, well, Jordan, why would I do it if the answer was the same? Right? If the answer is like go to bed earlier and be more mindful, like why the heck do I need $1,000 ring? That's exactly the question, right? However, the way that we get connected and motivated to our own goals is complicated. And I'm certainly not going to stand in the way of you finding some hack that helps you stay connected to the things I want you to do to be healthier. And if running a particular test or wearing a certain device or subscribing to a certain magazine or something helps you stay connected to your purpose and those actions that I want you to take anyways, then I think we're all winning, right? If health, if it helps you feel like your health is your hobby, which really, like, I think biohacking is more like a hobby than it is medicine. But if it helps you feel like your health is a hobby and something that you're excited to work on, again, I don't think we're losing. There's lots of people who feel better just because they're doing stuff, right? And that's not necessarily a placebo effect, right? But there is something to be said around how it feels when you feel connected to something. Now, interestingly, the opposite is also true, where often restriction and restraint can give people feelings associated with their health and wellness that are not always positive. And there's lots of discussion about this, that like the more restraint, the more restriction, the more like health shit that you do in a day, it can have a negative impact on someone's psychological well-being, someone's flexibility, right? So if your biohacking has meant that you take 18 supplements per day all through the day, and then suddenly your girlfriends want to go like on an overnight and you're questioning whether or not you should go because you're not sure you can take all your supplements with you, like that's not helpful, right? Not being flexible enough to be able to have joy in your life and experience positive things because of your biohacking, I think is problematic. And sometimes restriction and restraint, mostly temporarily, but it definitely makes people feel more powerful. And I'm always curious about this when people have started a super hardcore wellness plan and suddenly they feel amazing and their libido is better and they're stronger than they've ever been before and they barely need any sleep. There actually is like this detrimental psychological change that happens when we have a lot of restriction and restraint that does temporarily give people this sense of like elation, right? It's almost like, yeah, it's elation is the right word for it, where it's like, oh my gosh, I'm now vegan and I feel incredible. It's the act of restraint and restriction that makes people feel that way. And sometimes your body's even stress response to making massive changes in your nutrition can make people feel this elation, especially when people start to restrict things like food. It creates this sense of like heightened well-being. When if we check in with those same patients 6 months later, like they are dragging their ass. But in the immediacy of getting connected with a plan and feeling special and cool and like you're really doing something, it creates that feeling of power that I think we can misunderstand as being better. I'm not sure we're better when that's happening. And I would argue that you need to really fact check at 6 months to see if you actually are still better or if you're just flat out exhausted from your biohacking. So it's not always bad and wrong for a plan to make you feel better. if health is your hobby and this helps you feel connected and you're doing things anyways that I asked you to do, awesome, right? Like we'll take the win. But if we're feeling inflexible about the plan, if we're feeling fatigued from it, if we're feeling this, maybe elation from restriction and restraint, I think that's maybe negative, right? And I'm not sure that that's actually helping you achieve your health goals. The other thing we have to question is whether or not we're okay with being wrong. So, one of the things I'm always so curious about with health hacking is whether or not in, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, when we realize that half the stuff we're doing right now doesn't work or is wrong, are we willing to change our mind about it? I would argue that there are certain people who are not going to change their mind. They probably have a special interest in the lab test. It's interesting. I got an email today actually from this really, really shoddy lab company that 15 years ago, they were the bee's knees as far as integrative lab testing, and they're still promoting the same labs that have been proven to be ineffective over and over. And yet they're still like, hey, practitioner, did you want to order some test kits? Like they're still sending the same email asking if people want to buy their stuff when it's been disproven for years. But when your entire livelihood and the infrastructure of your company is based on biohacking, like you can't undo that, or maybe you should undo that mistake, but you certainly are going to take a very long time to change your mind about something. And I always hope that if you are curious or interested in biohacking, that if something came out saying that something wasn't effective or it wasn't working the way we thought it was, maybe you're just connected, right? Maybe you're just like more mindful about going to sleep and maybe the silly little ring doesn't do anything. Are we willing to change our mind about it? And I think if you're curious about being innovative with your health and you want to try on some new things, you have to do some like checking along the way to ask yourself, like, how would I feel if I learned that this wasn't accurate, right? Or this wasn't helping? Would I be okay with it? Would I change my mind? Would I stop doing it, right? I think that's incredibly important because this idea of citizen science is certainly making things more accessible, but it's also really downplaying the importance of medical decision making, right? Like there's a reason that we don't cut everybody open. There's a reason that we don't give everybody x-rays. There's a reason why we choose the testing and the treatment we do, right? We're trying to maximize benefit, minimize harm. And I know that an over-the-counter internet lab test that you buy might feel like it's not that harmful, maybe aside from spending a couple $100. But we would never want to act that way from a medicine side of things. So are we okay if it's like this citizen science hobby health hacking? Are we okay with that? And my kind of argument is maybe no. And it's interesting when I asked like I said, we get requests around this health hacking guests on the podcast all the time. And the one that I actually responded to, who will keep nameless, it's fine, and said, look, I can talk about health hacking, but only if we are willing to contextualize the lack of research for this and talk. I was like, I'm happy to talk about it in a positive light. Like, if you're a hobbyist, health hobbyist, if you feel frustrated and you want to get connected to something, if you feel better just by being on a plan, like these are all positive things. But I wanted to create transparency around some of the lack of research on particular biohacking practices or particular lab tests to just call a spade a spade. And it was so interesting when the response was, well, now you're not the right podcast for us. I was like, well, you thought I was like a minute ago. But what I stand for and what I'm always going to stand for is that we're talking about the most evidence-based things possible. And we're willing as a group, you and me, to really try and exercise and be our brains and be flexible about the way that we think about science and health, because it's so difficult to cruise the internet and know what's real and what isn't. I always want to equip you with these ideas and these questions and maybe a couple of answers around how to think about your own health and wellness and how to think about how you consume health. Because health is a biz, huge biz, especially the biohacking biz. And you get to be the buyer. Let's be a smart one, right? So we talked about lots of things today, right? Like there was a little bit of like definition around biohacking, although my definition is quite a bit broader. Talked about when maybe it's a positive thing to get that deeply connected with your health and, track things and get data and experiment a little and make some changes and see how you feel. I don't know if there's anything wrong with that per se, but you really need to ask yourself those super important questions. Like, is health your hobby? Are you okay with doing cutting edge science, even if that means that we find out we're wrong later, right? Does restriction and restraint actually make you feel good and powerful, but maybe not in a deep healing kind of way, maybe in a temporary elation kind of way? And would you tolerate this kind of decision making from conventional medicine? Because if you wouldn't, then biohacking might not be for you. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.